Christina Baker Klein is the author of 5 novels, of course, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, Orphan. Her other novels include Bird in Hand, The Way Life Should Be, Desire Lines, and Sweetwater. She is currently at work on a novel based on the iconic painting Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth. And I will add, she told us all about that work at dinner tonight. In addition to her 5 novels, she has written and edited 5 nonfiction books on a variety of topics, including parenthood, grief, and feminist mothers and daughters. Her essays, articles, and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, Money, More, and Psychology Today, among other publications. She was born in Cambridge, England, and raised there as well as in the American South and Maine. She's a graduate of Yale, Cambridge, and the University of Virginia. She has taught fiction and nonfiction writing, poetry, English literature, literary theory, and women's studies at Yale, NYU, and Drew University, and has served as a writer-in-residence at Fordham University for 4 years. She is a recipient of several Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation Fellowships and a writer-in-resident fellowship at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. We're thrilled that she's here tonight to launch this year's Reading Together program. Please join me in welcoming to Kalamazoo, Christina Baker Klein.
Oh my gosh, that was so long. I'm sorry. Hi, I'm so happy to be here. What a delightful group. I am really enjoying Kalamazoo, I have to tell you. I've never been here before. I must say I felt a little bit like an orphan train rider last night when I pulled into my hotel and it was completely dark. Does anyone know this? The downtown had no power for about 5 hours. So let's just say everything was pitch black. My room, I could not see anything. They gave me a glow stick. Have you ever held a glow stick? It does not light much. There's not much illumination. Anyway, the lights came blaring on at 12:30 last night, so that was my introduction. However, I've had a lovely day and got a tour of your beautiful downtown, and I'm just thrilled to be here. And obviously we all know about what happened here a little while ago, and I'm so sorry about that. It's so hard to imagine in a place like this that seems so wonderful. I know it can happen anywhere. And thank you, too, for the beautiful music. This, I don't know if you all know this, but those songs were traditional, and those Orphan Train Rider songs were actually folk songs that were written by Utah Phillips and others about the orphan trains that influenced me a lot as I was working. So here's what I'm going to do tonight. It's going to be fun, I promise. It won't be too long, about 45 minutes or so, and then I'll answer questions. But what I'm going to do is take you through my process in stumbling on this idea, this story, where it came from, how I ever decided to write a novel instead of a nonfiction book, which would sort of make more sense, I think. And then I'll tell you a little bit also about my creative process along the way and why I made some of the decisions I did. A couple things before I get started. If you have not, and you can hear I'm a little bit hoarse because I've been traveling around talking about this book quite a lot, so I'll drink some water. If you have not read my book, let me tell you what the story is. Orphan Train, in one sentence pretty much, is the story of a 91-year-old woman with a hidden past as an orphan train rider, which I'll explain more in a moment, and a 17-year-old girl who's in foster care. She's part Native American. She's sort of in and out of trouble. She's had a rough time of it. Steals a book from the library and has to do community service. And her community service is cleaning out that old woman's attic. If it's possible to turn the lights on me down a little, it's hard. It's kind of bright on my eyes. It's okay if you can't, but... Anyway, in the course of cleaning out this woman's attic, the two of them, the 17-year-old girl and this old woman who's an Irish immigrant, come to understand that they have more in common than either of them ever would have guessed. There's a whole story to be told about Molly, who is the part Penobscot Indian character, but that's not the story I'm going to be talking about tonight. When I go to Maine and I go to New England, sometimes I talk about my research, because to me at least it's very interesting. I did a lot of research about the Wabanaki Indians, the Confederation. I grew up in Bangor, Maine, which is 5 miles from Indian Island, which I describe in the book as a reservation, and I had Native American children in my classes. My mother was in the Maine state legislature, and she was very involved in Native American rights. So through her work, as she was doing some of her putting forth some, I don't know what's going on with this, putting forth some bills and stuff, I was working on this book, and so we sort of influenced each other, which was great. But what I'm going to do tonight is focus on the story of the orphan trains. So let's get started. It all began with this quirky child. This is my son, Hayden. In this photo, Hayden is 8 years old, playing the piano in his pirate costume, a little eccentric. And when this photo was taken, we were visiting my in-laws in Fargo, North Dakota. Now, Hayden was 8, my son Will was 7, and my son Eli was 3. If you've ever been to North Dakota in December, or even if you haven't, you might be able to guess. Of course, we were stuck inside during a blizzard, as one is in December. So after 3 days of this, my poor mother-in-law was going completely mad, and in desperation, she pulled a book off the shelf. This book. My mother-in-law, Carol, grew up in a little town called Jamestown, North Dakota. Her father was president of the local savings and loan. She lived there till she was 18 and went off to McAllister College with her sister. A sort of idyllic little childhood there. Her aunts lived in town. And this was sent to her. It was a centennial celebration of the town, filled with newspaper articles, which she promptly stuck on a shelf and never looked at again. When we came for that visit, and my children were driving her crazy, she pulled this book off the shelf, literally blew the dust off the cover, and started leafing through it with Hayden. And as they were going through the newspaper articles, wow, that's hard to see, but they came across this one. They called it Orphan Train, and it proved there was a home for many children on the prairie. Now, as I said, Carol grew up in this town, but according to this article, there were dozens, if not hundreds of children who ended up in Jamestown from the orphan trains, and yet she had never even heard of it. But even more astounding, her father was featured in this article. Her father, his younger brother, and their 3 sisters, 5 children, orphaned, sent on a train to Jamestown. And again, Carol had never heard a word. Now, as the mother of 3 boys, it saddens me to admit that I'm not shocked that the boys might have kept quiet about it, because boys can be a little squirrely in my experience. But I'm also the sister of 3 girls, and quite honestly, I am stunned that those sisters never said a word to their nieces, even growing up into the age of 18. By the time Carol looked through this book with my children, they were all dead. There was no one to even talk to about it. But how astounding is that this piece of history had happened that she knew nothing about. Well, my husband was a history major at Yale. You'd think maybe he might have come across this in his book Learnin' somewhere. His mother knew nothing about it, even though she was a descendant of a train rider. I certainly knew nothing about it, but I knew that this was a big story. I knew it was a big story, and I thought, this would be a great novel. Someone should write this. I am not that person. I felt like an interloper. As you've heard, I'm not a Midwesterner. My only connection is I married one. And when I started researching the orphan trains, and I discovered that 250,000 children, the largest migration of children in our nation's history, were sent on trains. I think everything's falling apart up here. I'm so sorry. between 1854 and 1929, 75 years, 250,000 children who now have over 4 million descendants, who care a lot, by the way, about that history, I felt completely intimidated. I felt like an interloper, that I didn't really have any business writing about this. As I began looking at what had been written, I saw that most of it was either historians who really had a bona fide reason for doing it, and descendants who had often self-published books about the orphan trains. So over the intervening 7 years, I wrote 2 other novels and a nonfiction book, and I went through the publication process with all of those books. And I was sort of throwing things into a file. I was amassing a physical file and a Google alert, and I started paying attention to things. I noticed where reunions were being held. I went to 1 reunion in New York City. I went to 3 in the Midwest. The first reunion I went to had 11 train riders. I went to Ireland, Galway in particular. The little village of Canberra, which is where my character leaves from in Orphan Train, sent the largest number of immigrants to America from Ireland at the time period that I was writing about, and I sort of learned a lot about that. So I was doing all this work. It was sort of percolating in the back of my mind. And I also found out this. This man, Charles Loring Brace, was a social reformer in New York City. And in 1853, he looked around and saw that there were 30,000 children living on the streets. There was no social mobility. There were no social programs of any kind. There was no welfare. There was no foster care. There were no child labor laws, which meant children were property, and there were no child there were no child welfare laws, and there were no child labor laws, which meant that poor children as young as 4 were expected to work, often working in factories in these urban centers. There are a lot of reasons that there were so many children living on the streets. Immigrants were pouring in to the country. And there were a lot of other reasons I'll explain in just a minute. But Charles Loring Brace looked around, he saw all these children, and he thought, we have to do something. And you know what? The wealthy at the time were really doing very little. They were funding the parks, they were funding museums, but there was a belief in the 1850s and beyond that poverty was an inherited affliction, meaning that it could be passed from one generation to the next, like a disease. It was believed that the poor, and in particular poor immigrants, had what they called bad blood. Their blood was tainted, and there was really nothing you could do about it. A few of them might rise up and find their own way, but it was essentially a cesspool down there in the ghettos, in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, in Queens, and in particular in lower Manhattan, where these immigrants were pouring in. And so there was no spirit at that time of giving money to the poor. And in the absence of any money from the government as well, it was a dire situation for many people coming into the country, because let's face it, every immigrant group that comes to this country, this is true today as it was in the 1850s, as it was in the 1900s, undergoes a hazing process. That is what it takes to be a new immigrant. Today it's Muslims and Mexicans. Back then it was the Irish and the Polish and the Jewish people and Italians. And it's just the way it works. And furthermore, one other thing I want to say about why we don't know about these orphan trains, there are a number of reasons, but one of the big ones is that the history of our country is not the history of the poor and the dispossessed. It's the history of presidents, of generals, of treaties, of laws, until very, very recently, and still in most part of the countries, in textbooks, for example, Native Americans are not well represented in their stories in our children's history books. The real stories of African Americans and the real stories of what happened to immigrants who came in. And let's face it, these orphan train children. Why is this a story that has been hidden in plain sight when it's such a large part of who we are? So as I say, there were many reasons for children to end up on the orphan trains. Of course, these poor immigrant families, many of them eventually sort of fell apart and couldn't take care of their children. Those children ended up on trains. I didn't think about this until I started researching the book, but the Civil War, which, as you know, happened in the 1860s, created a lot of war widows, vulnerable war widows who could not take care of their children, and a number of those children actually ended up on the orphan trains. The Industrial Revolution, of course, also played a role. To give you a sense of what New York was like at the time period that I was writing about, if you've read my book yet, will you raise your hand if you've started or read my book yet? Okay, so yeah, quite a few of you have. This is actually Elizabeth Street, where my novel begins. This is where Neve lives with her family. As you can see, it's an immigrant neighborhood. These tenements were overcrowded, they were fire hazards, people had all kinds of flammable material, there were lots of other reasons for the fires. These tenements were often far from firehouses. There were, of course, no telephones. There was all this flammable material, and people did things like build illegal fires in their unheated apartments. They often had no running water, no electricity. There were privies in the back. There is a wonderful museum in New York called the Tenement Museum. Have any of you been? Isn't it so great? By the way I got there with my kids was I bribed them by taking them to Katz's Deli, which is right around the corner. Katz's Deli is the one that's featured in When Harry Met Sally, you know, that famous scene. I didn't tell them that, but I knew it. But they loved the corned beef sandwiches. Anyway, so we went to Katz's Deli, and then we went to the Tenement Museum, which is right near here. And when you go to the Tenement Museum, you see what it was really like to live in these conditions. And they have a whole section of privies out the back and down in sort of in the basement backyard. Here's another picture of Lower Manhattan. You know, immigrants pouring in from all countries, speaking all kinds of languages. So as I mentioned, every immigrant group had it hard, you know, but at the time period that I was writing about, the Irish had it particularly hard. It was so difficult to be Irish. So imagine you're Irish, you know, in the 19th century, 1 million Irish are killed, essentially under the thumb of the British. They starve to death, etc. The Great Famine in Ireland, where England essentially, well, let's face it, every country that England colonizes, it exploits, and Ireland was no different. So in the 19th century, it was the Great Famine. In the 20th century, it was what they called the Civil War. Again, the British sort of meddling where they didn't belong. And as someone who is part English and part Irish, I feel that I embody both oppressed and oppressor in my very person. But anyway, it was really hard to be Irish in New York City. So these poor Irish would stagger off the boats from Ellis Island, often coming from villages that were destitute, dreaming of oranges and sunshine, and only to be spit on, as I show in some of the early pages of the book. Here are some examples of advertisements that were in the newspaper. To just give you one example, the middle one, wanted, a girl of neat and industrious habits and an amiable disposition to take entire charge of 2 small children. No Irish need apply. These signs were in saloons, they were in places people were trying to find jobs, they were even in churches. And it was just very difficult for the Irish to get a foothold, and a disproportionate number of Irish children ended up on the trains as a result, which is why I made my character Irish. If you go to the Tenement Museum, this is a postcard from there. This is actually the apartment. So they have apartments for different ethnic groups at different time periods. So there's a Polish family. I seriously am not that close to this. I don't know why that's happening. There's a Polish family from, say, 1890. There's a Jewish family from 1910. And it just so happens that the Irish-American family is exactly the time period that I was writing about. So if you go to the Tenement Museum and you read my novel, you'll essentially be stepping into the apartment that Neve lives in with her family. It's a railroad apartment, meaning that one room leads right into the next. Oh, sorry, yeah. Okay. Let me go back here. These little girls are gathering firewood. As I said, fires were rampant, and they were building an illegal fire in their apartment here. Here are children just loitering on the streets, a very common sight. So boys on the streets were organized into gangs as young as sort of 8 or 9 years old. Have any of you seen or read Gangs of New York? That's not so far off, actually. And it was very difficult to be a boy. Boys were often newsies, selling newspapers, and bootblacks. They worked in saloons. They became petty criminals. Girls were traditionally domestics. They cooked, cleaned, sewed, and took care of children. Those were the jobs they normally had. So when I'm working on a novel, I always have an idea board, which is a big bulletin board with lots of stuff on it. And so for Orphan Train, I had a wooden cross, a claddagh from Galway. I had a dream catcher from the Penobscot Indians in Maine. I had recipes and song lyrics that appeared in the book, and I had poems, and I had photographs. And I'm very influenced by I'm sort of visually influenced, which is partly why I chose to write my next novel, as you know, about a painting. But this is one of the photos that was on my bulletin board, and if you've read my novel, you might be able to guess. This was an inspiration for me, for the character of Neve with her younger sister, Maisie, in New York City. And I want you to notice, as I go through these next couple of photographs, how similar the expression in their eyes is, these children. And in her eyes, I see a sort of, a kind of defeat and wariness and desperation, I would say, maybe hunger. This little boy is a bootblack. He's about 8 years old, 7. He's also a bootblack. This little boy, this picture was also on my bulletin board. And if you've read my book, you might be able to guess. Can anyone guess? Yeah, exactly. Doesn't it look like what you would imagine Dutchie to be like? And what I wanted to capture, this Dutchie is a boy on the train who is a little bit older and he's very scrappy. I wanted to capture the kind of defiance that I see in his expression. Now, of course, this child would never have ended up on an orphan train. They were very careful to get good-looking, able-bodied children. They wanted these children to be chosen. That was the whole point. So any kind of physical or mental issue, they would not be put on a train. In fact, there's a character in my novel named Carmine, a little boy with a crossed eye, and he's based on a real person that I spoke with, a train rider, who they had sort of fretted over whether to put him on a train. They weren't going to do it because they thought that with a crossed eye he might not get picked, but he was actually chosen, and he was taken in by a loving family, and I wanted to show that in the novel. By the way, all the facts of my novel, in other words, every factual thing in it is true. I felt very beholden, actually, to these train riders. I interviewed 7 living train riders. I worked with the National Orphan Train Complex in Concordia, Kansas. I worked with descendants of train riders. I read over 300 first-person narratives. I wanted to make sure that if I was writing about this little-known story, and people would read it who didn't know about it, that they would not go away with the wrong idea of what it actually was. But even more than that, I wanted to kind of capture the truth of the orphan train experience. So I wanted to show you a representative story, not one that was either too sugar-coated, I guess, or too depressing and tragic. There were some tragic stories, of course, because the people who took in the orphan train riders were as varied as human nature. Some were kind and some were not. There was no screening process, so it was really a crapshoot. But anyway, so the things in the story, the things that happen to my characters often happen to people in real life. For example, one of my characters, Dutchie, is traded for a pig by the farmer who takes him in. That's a true story. The story about Carmine, as I've told you. My character, Neve, goes into multiple homes. She has her name changed multiple times. That was very common for train riders. The way people take in a dog from a shelter and change its name, that's how people thought of it at the time, and they would take in train riders and change their names without thinking too much about it. So I want to show you these 2 photos because it's kind of instructive about what happened to train riders, to kids on the streets of New York as they grew up. These children are in an alleyway playing with barrels. And here, only a few years later, these boys have basically organized into a gang. Now, the interesting thing to me psychologically about the orphan trains, one of the many interesting things, is that the most desirable children were, as you might well imagine, boys, right? Between the ages of about 9 and 14. The train riders were 2 to 14 years old, generally. But that population was also often the most troubled. Because, as I've told you, boys had a very rough time of it. They were joining gangs. Many of them were manipulative. They were pickpockets. They had possibly already been in and out of jail. Many of them had never been to school, didn't know how to read, couldn't spell. They had grown up on the streets. They often had thick accents. So being put into these homogeneous communities with Scandinavian and German immigrant families, small conservative communities, when they were Italian and Irish and Polish and speaking all different kinds of languages, often having heavy accents, it was a very difficult transition. And they'd had a rough time of it. As one train rider said to me, every single one of us who'd ridden on an orphan train had been through some tremendous trauma. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been there. The trains were the last resort. So you take these traumatized children and you layer on top of it these boys who've been living on their own, kind of in packs, and then you expect them to complacently be indentured to farmers until the age of 18 or 21. Essentially slave labor until the age of 18 or 21. How well do you think that went over? Not so well. Not so well. It worked sometimes, but the interesting psychology is that as mortifying as it was, as horrifying as it was to imagine, that you were going to sort of go to whoever took you, it was even more mortifying when you were actually standing up on that stage or in that train station to contemplate being rejected and not being chosen. So, there was this cognitive dissonance that the train riders describe. They don't quite call it that, but I call it that, where they have this mixed response to what they were going through, and it was very difficult for them. I love this photo because don't these two look like they're about 40 years old? Children, they grew up so quickly on the streets. Children in New York slept wherever they could. They slept on fire escapes, as you can see here. They slept on grates. Notice their bare feet. This little girl is a seamstress, and this photo of her was on my bulletin board. She's 9 years old, same age as my character. And again, her expression really captivated me. I wanted to capture that when I have Neve working for the Burn. She goes into a cottage industry in a home where she's sewing, and she just feels trapped. She doesn't know if she'll ever escape. And I thought that this girl's expression really showed that as well. Again, that kind of cottage industry was very common. People who took in train riders often took them in for that kind of labor. Now, this is a group of actual train riders. These two chaperones, H.D. Hill and Nita Clark, took over 100 trainloads of children. And as you'll notice, they're quite well dressed, aren't they? And so are these children. And I started to think, okay, who's paying, right, for the travel of these children, and who's paying for these clothes? Because the train riders were completely stripped of their identities and their clothes when they were taken. When the decision was made to put a child on a train, there was no turning back. By the way, only about a third of the children were actual orphans. The rest of them were abandoned. They were runaways. They were taken out of homes. And I always think of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the child catcher in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. The police on the streets of New York would actually pick children up and take them to the trains. Parents would tell their children not to go out after dark because you might get picked up and put in a paddy wagon and put on an orphan train. There are stories of parents showing up at the train stations and begging that their children be given letters and addresses that identify them so that when they get back on their feet, they can have their children back. And all those letters I went through in an archive at New York Public Library. They were never given to the children, and they were under lock and key until very recently. It's just heartbreaking when you start seeing. But the belief at the time was not only that it was better to forget, but that it was possible to forget, which we all know is not always as easy as it it seems. But anyway, I was wondering, so who was paying for these children? As I say, the wealthy weren't really helping, and Charles Loring Brace was a social reformer, but he didn't have much money. Finally, I stumbled on an academic article that was pretty critical of the orphan trains, and the author had gone through the ledgers of the train companies. And what she found was that in 1854, the railroads were expanding massively into places where no one lived. They were building depots all the way up the Midwest, and they needed bodies. And they banked on the idea that these children would go into these rural areas and populate them and stay, that they would not return to the East Coast. And in fact, they could not have been more accurate. Not only did most children never return to New York, most of them never even left, say, the 20-mile radius that they were put into. One train rider said to me, "I had been through so much turmoil, I just wanted to stay put." And so, 1929, the train stopped running, and I thought, what happened in 1929? The stock market crashed, right? The Depression began. There were more children than ever in need. So why would the train stop running? Well, the train companies built their last depot, they pulled out, and they stopped paying. And that's pretty much what happened. As my son, who's majoring in economics in college, says, it all comes down to money. It's not quite that simple. There was a little bit of a backlash, not so much from my area, the East Coast, out of sight, out of mind, good, they're gone, hope they're better off. But from the Midwest, where I read editorials that said things like, stop sending us your refuse, your criminal element infecting our small towns and rural areas, your garbage on a barge, basically. And they were, but that alone would not have been enough to end the trains because they were a private program. They were not a government program. The government never got involved. So children got older, you can see they started to sort of figure out what was happening to them. I don't know how many of you have read the works of an author named Temple Grandin. So Temple Grandin is a nonfiction writer. She's amazing. She's brilliant. She has autism, Asperger's syndrome. She writes about animal and human psychology. And one of her essays is about how she was commissioned to do this study to figure out how to get cattle to slaughter in a way that would be humane so that they don't stampede. And what she found is that if you take cattle from a large pen into a slightly smaller pen and a slightly smaller pen, and then you funnel them into a chute so that they move slowly, one behind the next, all the way up, they'll march without any problem or any provocation of any kind straight into the slaughterhouse. And I always think about that, actually, when I think about how these children were herded onto the trains, because it was sort of the same psychology. The night before they were to go, or maybe a couple of days before, if they were in the orphanage, they would be told, you're going to go to a family who loves you. I talked to train riders who said it wasn't until they were actually standing on the platform that they knew that they would be going on a train. And that it wasn't until they were halfway across the country that they knew they'd be lining up by height to be plucked randomly out of the lineup by whoever came along. So as the children got older and began whispering among themselves, they began to sort of figure this out. But if you think about it, there's no way those older boys would have gotten onto a train if they'd really known what they were in for. So it was necessary for them to keep quiet about it. My novel went through about 20 different covers, and this is one of them. I'm showing you this one because of the suitcase. These are exactly the kind of suitcases that the train riders carried with them. And my mother-in-law, whose father, as I told you, was on that train, found an actual orphan train rider's suitcase in a North Dakota little antique shop. And when I go around locally in my area, I bring it with me. You know, when you're writing a novel, you have a lot of influences that are conscious, and you have a lot that are unconscious. And it wasn't until I saw this attempt at a cover that I remembered how obsessed I had been with the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. Doesn't she look just like Laura? I read each of those books about 6 times, including the really dark ones at the end, like the one Rose wrote and everything. And when I saw this cover, I realized, of course, you know, that without even realizing it, I'm sure that my obsession with those books was part of the reason that I was so interested in the story. And I have now been to 3 of the communities that Laura Ingalls Wilder lived in, doing community reads, so that's been kind of fun to do. For a long time, this was the only photo, it's such a bizarre photo, that I could find of actual train riders on a train. They are literally standing on the train. Why are there so many of them? Most trains held between 10 and 30 children. Why are they on top of the train? This is undated, and we don't know where it was taken. After I published the book, the daughter of a train rider sent me a picture of her mother in this much more representative group of children. This is a North Dakota orphan train. Of course, a popular crowd of train riders, all boys. Even more popular, slightly older boys. Not to put too fine a point on it, the National Orphan Train Complex says we had just gone through a civil war to abolish slavery, but the farms and shops still needed labor. Some of these children took the place of slaves. They were indentured or contracted. Adoption was not required. Family did not have to pay more than room and board. Now, there were no African American children on the trains, and I always thought that it was because Charles Loring Brace was afraid they wouldn't be chosen, but essentially because of racism. But in fact, I learned later, Brace was an abolitionist. He was afraid that if he put black children on the trains, they would be enslaved and not be let out at the age of 18 or 21. This is an actual certificate of indenture, and the important line is simply that we shall place such child as an apprentice until they arrive at the age of, and notice it's written in 21 years. I don't know. Is that the one you said was sticking? Let's see, there we go. Trains of all babies were called mercy trains. But it was much more common, as I describe in the novel, to have the older girls taking care of their babies on trains. So this little girl is 9 years old, and I actually didn't stumble on this story until I had already written my novel, but it was interesting because it's very similar. 9 years old, in 1929, she rode the train the same year as my character, at exactly the same age. Her name is Alice Ayler. This is a picture of her with her mother and 4 younger siblings. And what she has to say about this photo is, she says, I was raised in a forest, we were raised, my siblings and I, in upstate New York, surviving on green water and berries, she said. Their mother died. The children were all separated, as was almost always the case with the orphan trains. The children were almost always separated. Again, your past is not your past. Your parents are not your parents, so they wanted to separate siblings. She said, I went on an orphan train to the Midwest, and she says, I moved from family to family. I was a hired hand without pay. I was told constantly that I had bad blood. I was always looking at my veins and wondering, what could be bad about it? It looked just like everyone else's. People have asked whether the second home that my character goes into, the Groats, was an exaggeration. And I just want to say, no, it was not, and that there were worse stories. I'm not going to read you this, but I'll paraphrase quickly. Essentially, this is an article from the Washington Post. Superintendent Hall of the North Dakota Children's Home calls the press because he's afraid that the children coming in on orphan trains, none more than 4 years old, are going to be doomed to serfdom, to drudgery, he says, which will amount to serfdom. They're being taken in by families who live way out in the middle of nowhere, far from towns and schools, who don't speak English and essentially will treat them as slaves unless the state can step in and prevent it. And of course, the state did not step in and prevent it because the state did not get involved. So, this is what could happen at the far end of that spectrum. I was so delighted to find this map. It's very partial. It's only until 1910. It's only one agency. Even then, the numbers are very low. Record keeping was very spotty. But as you can see, the children went all over the United States, even into slaveholding states. I actually have a slightly different version of that map. Let's see here. I was in upstate New York. I was in New York City giving a talk, and a woman in the front row was in her 90s with her daughter. And she saw this map, and she said, I'm remembering now, she says, I was raised on a farm in upstate New York, and every summer the orphan trains came, and we had, these children lined up by height, and we took the strongest boys. She said, those boys just had the most marvelous time laboring in our fields. And I thought, I would really like to talk to those boys. This is the journey of my character, which was very common. 3 days across the country, to Chicago and up Minneapolis. Albans is a made-up name. I didn't want to be constrained by that one little place, as is Spruce Harbor, which is a sort of combination of several little villages in Maine. Okay, these are actual posters that were put in train stations and in city halls, et cetera, not unlike slave posters, if you've seen them a little bit. This is the one that I quote from the book, and it has the most poignant line. It says, a company of homeless children are arriving. These children are of varying ages and both sexes, having been thrown friendless upon the world. And then it goes on to say, being mostly of respectable parentage, these are desirable children and worthy of good homes. Of course, they had no idea. They were just, this was sales, right? They had no idea what kind of homes they had come out of. And then it says they're indentured and that the indenture provides for 4 months of schooling. We all know that's not very much, but even that was difficult to enforce, particularly for those older boys who had little incentive for going to school and those farmers who had little incentive for sending them. Here's a picture of those children lining up by height. I've talked about how hard it was to be Irish, and it was also very difficult to be a girl. Girls were the last chosen between the ages of about 8 and 14. They were considered fallen women, a threat to the female in the household, of course through no fault of their own. But it was even worse to be a redhead. Redheads were so loathed, feared, and despised that they were actually banned from the orphan trains for a period. So this is an article from the New York Times, 1901, Foundlings Find Homes, No Redheads. So to paraphrase, it says 52 black, brown, yellow, and flaxen-haired children fill a special car, no redheads or children with freckles among them. It says, redheads, especially those with freckles, are not easily placed in homes, even if their hair is of Titian and their freckles beauty spots, which I love. So they ask the traveling agent why, and he says he's inquired all over the United States and has invariably been told that redheads fight too much and have bad tempers generally. He said he does not agree with this verdict, but he finds it very difficult to defeat a tradition that has stood for many generations. Let's see. So these are my 2 oldest children. Hayden's wearing black and Will's wearing white. So as I told you, my son Hayden was 8. He's now 21 and a junior in college. Will is 20 and a sophomore in college. Is that called Irish twins, I think? So it was really interesting to work on this book. When they were in their teens and living at home, and I was telling them about my research. I mean, this was shocking to me. So we were sitting around the kitchen island, and their friends are there saying things like, redheads have no souls, and ginger, just all this. And Will was saying, my son Will, well, in middle school, of course, anything that sets you apart is what you're going to get teased for. So, it's not a big deal to us. But he said, but it is interesting. If you Google redheads and look at images, this kind of thing is still there and comes up. So sad, my poor children. Or this. As I began researching, I sort of fell down the rabbit hole of this research because it was so fascinating. Did you know that in the Middle Ages, redheads were burned at the stake in England? And did you know that even at the turn of the 20th century in Ireland, do you know how many redheaded people live in Ireland? If a redheaded woman walked past a ship before it had been christened, it was considered bad luck. at the turn of the 20th century. I mean, seriously. Anyway, so much information. Go to Wikipedia. You'll be shocked about redheads and the prejudice against them. But what's so interesting for me, having written this book, is when I go and talk to schools and universities about prejudice and discrimination, they're stunned to look at this and to realize that redheads actually faced the kind of mild teasing that redheads still get today is actually rooted in some very real prejudice and discrimination, and that's fascinating. Speaking of redheads, this is the claddagh, the Irish cross from Galway, if you don't know what it looks like. If you've ever been to Galway, you will see it everywhere. Most people have rings, but they have earrings and tattoos and baseball caps and T-shirts and necklaces. It is the Irish cross, and I loved the symbolism of it, so I write about that quite a bit in the book. This is the village of Canberra, which is, as I told you, where many immigrants came from. This village was essentially emptied out at the time period in the early 20s. And it is 10 miles south of Galway, 5 miles from where the Titanic left. It's a beautiful little village if you have a chance to go. We're getting to the end here. Many train riders went to their deaths without telling anyone what had happened to them. But in 1960, a woman was talking to her best friend, and she sort of confessed that she was a train rider. And her friend said, you know, I've heard about this other person. The two of them got together. It turned out there was a third person, and those 3 women in North Dakota said, what would happen if we put a notice in newspapers all over the Midwest and see if anybody would show up? So in 1961, 9 people showed up in Wahpeton, North Dakota. 1965, Fargo, North Dakota. 1969, Little Falls, Minnesota. It's this wonderful woman named Sister Justina, a nun who I knew for many years until she died, sadly, in her hundreds. She was over 100 when she died. But she, at the age of 17, had been a train rider. She'd been put into a home of all boys, and bad situation, walked across town, knocked on the door of the convent, and said, will you please take me in at the age of 17? And then she never left. And she lived in this convent and was a train rider. She learned about these women and this group, and so she's hosted those reunions ever since. Here you are, 1969, at the convent in Little Falls, Minnesota. So as you can see, over time, these reunions got bigger and bigger, and then, of course, they got smaller and smaller. For a long time, the orphan train riders were so private. They would not let their descendants in. They would not let press in. It was only them. But those feisty descendants batted down the doors and insisted on being included. In fact, it was not until the descendants started becoming lawyers that the records began to be opened. The birth certificates of the train riders were altered, destroyed, and locked up. And it wasn't until lawsuits happened that finally they began to have some access. Even then, it was often fruitless because they had been altered beyond recognition. But by the time I came along, the Children's Aid Society and the Foundling said, come, help yourself to our records. We're so open to help yourself. But, it wasn't that way for a very long time, and it was frustrating and difficult for the train riders. So here I am at a reunion. So they still happen today. The first reunion I went to in New York had 11 train riders. The second had 7. The third had 4. That's this one. 3 of these 4 women are no longer with us. The one, Sister Justina, is next to me. The one next to the woman in red is still alive. She's about 102, I believe. And oh gosh, this is the most amazing thing. So when I started this book, there were about 150 living train riders, and today there are fewer than 10. And they're between about 95 and 105 years old. So how lucky was I to stumble on this story at a time when I could be part of living history? So the woman next to me is named Renee Wendiger. She's the daughter of the woman who's still alive, the woman in maroon. And she runs the New York Train Riders Association, which is in Little Falls, Minnesota. She lives in Sleepy Eye, I love that, Minnesota. And So she's the encyclopedia of all things train rider. And when I finished my novel, she said, this is really uncanny. There is a living train rider you've never met, did not interview, who is so similar to your character. She's 93. She came over, her family came from Ireland, through Ellis Island, tenement fire on the Lower East Side, across to rural Minnesota, multiple families, name changed multiple times, even ended up marrying a soldier from World War II, and stayed in rural Minnesota. How crazy is that? All these coincidences. She said, you must call her. Now, keep in mind, I had just finished my book, and my thought was, are you joking? I have finished my book. I am done. I am not calling one more person. I have interviewed all these people. I've done all this research. But of course, I had to call this woman. Anyway, I picked up the phone. The smartest thing I ever did was I actually figured out how to record this conversation. I picked up the phone. We spoke for an hour and a half. And as I had feared, talking to her meant that I had to go back and change something very important in my book. This is that woman. I know, is she so adorable? Her name is Pat Thiessen. This is her first Easter in the Midwest. She's carrying 2 Easter eggs, and what she has to say about this picture is, she says, I was 4 years old in 1918. I rode the train to Red Lake Falls, Minnesota. Nothing was said about anything. All I knew is that I was indentured. The people who took me in were older. They were grandparents in their 50s. She says, the relatives were not that happy about me. They kind of looked down on me. They must have figured, what is she doing, taking on a little kid like this, about the woman who took her in. That's her in the blue dress. Doesn't she look exactly the same? It's even the same pose. So, the final reunion that I went to, Minneapolis, so excited to meet Pat. I got off the plane, Little Falls is about an hour and a half, I guess. So I got off the plane in Minneapolis. My phone rang, it was Renee, telling me that Pat had died that day. I never got to actually meet her. And Sister Justina, the woman in black, of course, she had died a week and a half earlier. So there were supposed to be 4 train riders. 2 were ill, 2 were dead. For the first time since these reunions began, there were no train riders present, but there were over 300 descendants, all carrying their 3-ring binders and their masses of material. And so a nun came up to the front and said, we have decided here at Little Falls Convent that we will hold these reunions into perpetuity, but they will no longer be called reunions. From now on, we're going to call them conferences, because that's what they've become, a place for you descendants to exchange information. And that is exactly what they are. It's a busy hive of genealogical research that's quite impressive to see. But again, it just points out over the scope of, or over the scan of writing this book, you know, what happened to the train riders. So there's Pat, as I say. Here she is as a little girl. And here she is, here's what she said, among many other things, but this is the one that I think most profoundly influenced me. I asked her, how has being a train rider affected you in your life? Keep in mind, she's 93, and she said, lots of time, late at night, not sleeping. I think, I would have liked to have been raised by my own people. I think about that a lot. And I said, do you still think about it? And she said, oh yes, I do. She said, I do wish I'd been brought up by my people. I miss it. I don't know what I'm missing, but I miss it. And I said, what does it feel like to miss that? And she said, it feels incomplete. I keep wondering, what were my grandparents like? My uncles? What did they have in the family that I could have enjoyed? Who would I be? I think of all these things, you know? I had a good home. I don't mean that, her final home, but I always felt that they were not my people, and they weren't. It was something about the finality of that and the emotion. You know, I spoke to, as I said, a lot of train riders. I read all these narratives, but Pat was the first one who I think captured so eloquently what that really felt like. And I realized that I had not done that yet. So I had to go back in to my novel, and if you've read it, the third home that my character goes to, and her name is Vivian, she's taken in by these people who, she has a roof over her head, she has enough food, and they're kind to her, but she never quite belongs. She never quite feels that they're her people. And I think that a lot of train riders have been saying that to me in different ways along the way, and I had not quite gotten what that felt like until I talked to Pat. So it's very special to me that I had that experience. To end with a happy story. When Pat was in her mid-50s and her son was in his 30s, he was bound and determined to find out what had happened to her. He finally got his hand on her birth certificate from the Foundling Hospital, which is the Catholic organization that eventually ended up sending children. And what did this man do, who had never been on a plane in his life? He booked 2 tickets to Dublin, and as he described it, they had a hair-raising journey on the wrong side of the road to this little village, Warringstown, Ireland. So the birth certificate had the name of this village, it had the name of a girl, and her age, 18. And that's all it had. So they got out of the car, they went into the corner store, and he said, anyone recognize me? Or her? And, no. And then he pulled out the birth certificate and said, all we have is this village and this name. And someone in the back of the store, an old man, said, I don't know about the girl, but there is a family with that surname. They live 4 houses down, 4 semi-detached houses down with the blue door. So they walk 4 semi-detached houses down and knock on the blue door, and the door opens, and it's their entire family, her entire family. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Philomena, but what happens to 17-year-old Irish girls in 1913 who get pregnant? They either get sent to convents or they get sent to America. This girl was put on a boat to America, and no one ever heard from her again. They don't know what happened to her. But Pat was so thrilled to connect with her family. And from then on, as long as she was alive, the Irish people came to Minnesota, and the Minnesotans went to Ireland, and they had this lovely connection, which, by the way, is pretty unusual for a train rider. So that's the story I love to tell. There were many problems, as I've mentioned, with being a train rider. I mean, just simply not having a birthday or a birth certificate or anything. How did you register to vote? How did you drive a car? How did you get married? All of those things. And of course, like closed adoption, there were all these other issues as well. But the amazing thing is that a lot of those orphan train riders thrived. 2 became governors of the states of North Dakota and actually Alaska, which was not even a state when the orphan trains were running. They became doctors and lawyers and shopkeepers and social workers and librarians and teachers. And those small conservative communities that for many train riders were hard to break into, eventually, once they settled in, it was often rocky for a while, but once they settled in, they became safe havens. And as I say, the vast majority of train riders stayed in the Midwest and, yes, indeed, populated the Midwest. And so I think it's a true story about America. And, you know, one day I'll just end by saying, one day I was doing an event in Maplewood, New Jersey, and I was rushing to the stage late as usual. Whenever I drive myself, I'm always split right at the very last second. So I'm rushing up to the front, and this guy grabs my arm, and I was like, I have to go up there. And he had a magazine in his hand, and he said, I have to talk to you. And so I had to stop, and he was on the cover of this magazine, Lions Club magazine. I don't know if any of you are Lions Club members. Okay, so he was on the cover of Lions Club magazine with his brother. And the story he told, which I'll tell you very quickly, is that his daughter read my novel, and she started thinking about what he had told her about him, and she said, I need more information, Dad. Were you on an orphan train? And he had never spoken about it. So what happened was his mother was a single mother with 2 very small children. She knocked on the door of the Foundling in New York City and asked to be taken in as a charwoman so that they would take care of her children. She was taken in as a charwoman, but they put her children on 2 different orphan trains. I know, tragic story. Anyway, this little boy ended up, he ended up in New Jersey somehow. I think he must have gone to upstate New York and then over. His daughter reads my book, asks him all these questions, and she finds his brother in California who had an almost identical life. They drove the same car. They had the same number of children. They belonged to the same kind of church. I mean, there were all these things that were really similar. And the two of them were also Lions Club members. Anyway, the Lions Club wrote this lovely article about them and featured them on the cover. But when I was telling this final part about the orphan train riders and how they did well, he was on stage with me, and he said, you know, what I believe is that those of us who came through that experience had a survivor's spirit, and that's what kept us going and persevering, and that's why so many of us ended up doing well, and it's served us in good stead as we've moved through life. And I thought that was a really lovely way to think about his experience. You've probably heard everything you ever wanted to know about the orphan trains, but if you want more information, this is actually my old website. I now have a new website where I answer a bazillion questions, and there are also lots of other resources. And that's it. Thank you all so much. Are we okay for time? Do we want to ask some questions? Should we do a few questions? Is that okay? Who do I ask? Yes.
My grandmother
Oh.
and her brothers and sisters were on one of the orphan trains that went from New York to Arkansas. And my grandmother was adopted by a well-to-do family there. And I'd sure like to find more information out about her. How do I go about that?
You contact the most wonderful organization, which I mentioned already. The National Orphan Train Complex will help you. They're terrific. Just call them up or email them at their website. They're lovely.
She came from Holy Island.
You know, they have a lot of resources, and tell them I sent you.
All I can think of is it's so cold in Michigan, and New York is really cold. Won't those kids get frostbitten or even die on the streets with all the cold weather?
Yeah, of course.
Anyone helping them out in terms of that?
Yeah, no, they did die on the streets. The infant mortality, sorry, not only infant, but the childhood mortality rate on the streets of New York was so high. That's one of the huge issues. Once they came here, they were supposed to be promised to families, so, you know, or they were going to go to families. They weren't left on their own on the streets here. There are so many versions of this story, and, you know, I found out, meaning, the time of the orphan trains was the heyday of rail travel in this country, and children were actually sent on trains all over the place. They were sent from the Midwest to Canada, from California to the Midwest, Midwest to the East Coast. My husband's grandfather and his siblings actually were sent from Missouri to North Dakota. We discovered as we were researching the book. So his train wasn't a quote-unquote official one, but there were just children on trains all over the place. It was a way they saw to solve this problem. More? I know you have questions. Don't ask them when you're standing in line to sign your book, because people will be mad at you. Yes?
My dad was put in an orphanage during the Depression because his mother died in childbirth.
Yeah.
His dad could not raise the 5 sons. And I think that's probably another area that would be really interesting to find out what happened to those kids. My dad never really talked about it much. And I only found out about it through a local PBS show about this particular orphanage where he stayed from the age of about 4 till about 10.
Yeah, you know, as I travel around the country talking about the book, I learn about all these orphanages. I was just in Dayton, Ohio. They had a really big one. Minneapolis had a big boys' home. And sometimes train riders ended up in those places. It wasn't that common, because the whole point was to find them families, and particularly farm families. But that did happen. I know. You know, when you start researching a book like this, I can't even tell you how many incredible stories there are, every one of which could be a book. And that's why so many descendants write books. I swear to you, I get a book a week in the mail from a descendant who's written, because there are these great stories, and they become entirely obsessed. Is anyone into genealogical research? Because I think you can get quite obsessed with it, and it's really interesting. I have people come to events with, like, big binders. So.
You had mentioned that on some of your demographic maps there,
Yeah.
that apparently Michigan was a very, big recipient of
Yeah.
orphan-trained children. I grew up in a small town that's a little over an hour just southwest of here in the corner of the state. And next to my town is a little town called Dowagiac. And the tradition there, and I've heard it in many places, is that Dowagiac was the first stop for the very first orphan train. You ever heard any information that would confirm that?
I don't know about Michigan. I really don't. I've concentrated on Minnesota because that's where my husband's family is from, St. Paul, actually. And then they ended up, as I said, in North Dakota. But so I knew I would be writing about that state, and I didn't learn a whole lot about individual other states. But every state I go to, I learn about them. Did you know that Louisiana has an orphan train museum, a national orphan train museum? A lot of children ended up in Louisiana, of all places. But so I don't, and maybe you should write a book about it.
Maybe I'll look into it.
That would be good. That would be really
Thank you.
good. The National Orphan Train Complex could no doubt help you with that.
When I was reading the part where the farmer was inspecting Dutchie,
Yeah.
I kept thinking to myself, this is like a slave auction.
Yeah, I know. Those boys it really was for the boys. And, they felt their teeth and their muscles. They made them do push-ups and jumping jacks even. They were farm labor. I mean, that's what they were. There were no bones about it. But what's interesting? Charles Loring Brace was, as I told you, an idealist, a social reformer. His dream was that the children would be adopted. That was what he hoped and planned on. You people probably have already figured out why that didn't happen most of the time, but I'm a little dense, so I didn't figure it out for quite a while. I'm going to tell you, even though you probably all already know. Because most of these children were going to homes with farmers, and of course the government was in the habit of giving, say, 150 acres to farmers at the time. Farmers were amassing thousands of acres, bonanza farms. A farmer would take a child in, pick a child out of the lineup, take that child home, and the family would say, there is no way that ragamuffin from the streets of New York is inheriting our land. And of course, adoption would mean inheritance. So the fact that many of these children went to farms meant that there was this natural disincentive built in to adopt them. And so it was purely transactional for a lot of those boys. And by the way, I don't mind if you yell out, but there it comes. I can repeat.
Is there a story behind the final cover and the girl in the picture?
I don't know that little girl, but I will tell you why I liked it. I mean, listen, I told you, we went through 20 covers. It got so I saw an email from my editor in my inbox with an attachment, and I cringed because I knew I was going to hate it, whatever it was. It took a long time to find a cover that felt right to me. I'll tell you why this one did. I liked the fact that as you open, you're opening the train door to step into the story. I loved that idea. And I also liked the fact, to me, she looks 9 years old. It wasn't until I saw the German cover where they blew this image up and it was only her face that I realized she has multiple earrings. How weird is that? I'd never even noticed. We're airbrushing that out. But I really did not notice that. None of us noticed that, actually. But I also like that she's reflecting on something, and that the outdoors is reflected in it. And there's this thing I do in the book about ghosts. I talk about living with ghosts, living with the past, and it felt sort of ghostly to me. And so I loved that, and all the different textures of the cover. Anyway, it felt right when it happened. Some people say she's not redheaded enough, and in fact, in some countries, they've dyed her hair much redder. So, yeah.
Hello.
Hi there.
Oh,
I got it.
oh, okay.
Hi. First of all, it's a pleasure meeting you, seeing you.
You too.
Last year I met a lady. She's in her 70s, and she said she was part of the. She was on the orphan train. However, she had a twin sister. Now she told me the twins were never really separated.
Yeah.
So, and she's in her 70s. She's in the process of publishing her book too about her ordeal on the orphan train because she was abused.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's
I mean, are you familiar with the
impossible
twin
that she's in her
situations?
70s. I am trying to think how, okay, the last train ran in 1929. I think that she probably was on a program like this, but perhaps not the quote-unquote official orphan trains. To be honest, it doesn't matter. There were children transported even after the trains ended, but she's writing her story now?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great.
She was going to come, but she was very sick today.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, please say hello for me.
Okay, I got you.
I think there was someone here, yeah.
Yes, thank you. How long did you compile the research, and how long did it take to write the book? Could you share a little bit about the process of how you did that?
Yeah, she's asking how long it took to write the book and the process of writing it. You know, I guess it took about 2 years. My father is a historian, and I remember at one point he said, "You have to stop researching right now, or you'll never write the book." And so at a certain point, I felt like Harold and the Purple Crayon, you know that children's book? I felt like I was drawing the boat before I could step into the boat. Then I had to draw the oars and the water, and then, you know, the doorknob before I could draw the door. I mean, I was researching and writing as I went along. So I had read a lot about it, but you know, it was hard to then start because you've read all the stuff and I don't know if any of you have had that experience where you're, when do I stop researching? I don't know enough. But he said, this is a trap. I tell my PhD students that they need to put down the book, step away from the book, and look at the blank page. And so that's what I did. I write longhand, so my first draft is, is on pads of paper, and then my next draft is typing in. So I went through about 10 different drafts. You know, the hard thing for me with this novel is that the material is very emotional, and I didn't want the book to be sentimental in any way or to feel overly emotional. So the prose style is actually a little bit, I don't know if you would say dry or just, I tried to cut any bit of sentimentality that I could from it, any kind of twee, unearned sentiment. And so the research was one intense thing, and then for me the writing was another, because getting the tone right, showing what she had gone through without editorializing too much about it, was another part. So as I say, the whole thing was maybe 2 or 2.5 years. I mean, books just take a long time. And, you know, even now, like I just finished this book that's coming out. It's coming out in a year. I mean, isn't that silly? But it takes a year, the whole process of production and, all the stuff that you do pre-publication. So, and it will have been a long time since I wrote Orphan Train. It doesn't feel that long. Yeah. There was someone over. Yes. Yeah, Sorensen. Yeah, I mean, I worked with the Children's Aid Society, so I knew about their policies, and I read all of that stuff. There's a wonderful book, a nonfiction book about the orphan trains by a writer named Stephen J. O'Connor, and he's written kind of the definitive history of the orphan trains, and there are a lot of materials from and about the organizations and that sent them, and the people and the volunteers and communities. You know, Mr. Sorensen that was a very typical kind of volunteer, because, you know, they were helpful to a point, but the truth is, because children were property, it was much more likely that an adult would be believed than that a child would be believed. And furthermore, the volunteers had a tremendous incentive for keeping the children in the homes that they were already in, because it was just such a pain in the neck when you had a loose child and no one around to take care of him or her. So that was sort of how it went for a lot of kids. Yes? This one over here? Okay. Over there. Yes? Hello. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh. Nobody referenced so he's talking about Horatio Alger's books, which I've read some of, but obviously not as much as you have, I think, and how they were sort of hard work will get you ahead, and it was sort of inspiring for poor children to do that. No direct references to him, to his books, but certainly that was a growing belief. And I will say one other thing, actually, that you're reminding me, which is that I'm going to make a gross generalization about Midwesterners now, not being one myself. In the absence of therapy, I believe that there is something in the Midwestern sensibility that might actually be useful to someone who has undergone trauma in terms of moving ahead and succeeding in life. And I have to say, I say this when I go to all over the Midwest, and no one has yet refuted it. You can tell me if you do. But being married to a man who does this with my own children, don't complain about your troubles too much. Put one foot in front of the other. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Everybody has problems. Let's move on. Nobody needs to hear you whining. I feel that that's kind of a way of life. And a lot of people had hard lives, and it was the Depression, and there was all kinds of stuff going on, and eventually, and so I do think that they didn't. A lot of them didn't wallow. And that probably was healthy enough in that way. Yes? Yeah. The Burns. Yeah. 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 Yeah, but some people haven't read the book, so. Okay, so she's basically asking if the second family that my character goes into, and sorry, this is a spoiler, but where there was an attempted molestation, if that happened. Of course it happened. There were all these girls who were, undergoing puberty, and there were all these boys. There are stories, for example, okay, here's the worst one that I've heard. A farmer, like a guy, taking a train rider to a sod hut in North Dakota with a pregnant wife and 9 children, and the wife dies in childbirth, and next thing you know, the train rider is pregnant and raising all these children. That kind of story happened, that kind of thing happened, and only because there was no regulation, there really were no checks and balances, the people were not screened. Again, the people who took in these train riders were as varied as human nature. I didn't want to show the worst kind of stories, and there's sort of a self-selecting group of the train riders who would normally tell their stories, because the people to whom the most terrible things happened don't usually talk about it, but some of them have. And there were stories of boys being beaten and abused in all kinds of ways too, just in the way that things happen to kids in foster care. I mean, think about what happens today, and we have regulations and checks and balances. So I included the story of the Groats because I wanted to show how vulnerable the train riders were, and what was, the sort of scope of things that they could face. But I didn't want to, and some were murdered. There were stories of train riders who were murdered. I mean, it happened.
You've mentioned Christina's World.
Don't know where you are. Okay. A voice from the heavens, yes?
Right. Okay. You've mentioned Christina's World and your work on that. Can you talk to us a little bit about that next novel?
Yes,
and
thank
that
you.
marvelous, of course, picture by Andrew Wyeth.
Yes. Okay, I'll do it quickly. I know everyone's ready to go, and I'll sign, and this is my last question. And let me also say, because I know you're selling books out there, I have 5 novels, as you know, and I'm just going to tell you quickly, if you already have Orphan Train and you're considering another one, my first novel was Sweetwater. It's probably the most similar to Orphan Train in some ways. It's based on my crazy Southern family in Sweetwater, Tennessee, in part. And but there's a relationship. You know, when you write novels, you don't always know what your themes are until critics tell you what they are, which is a weird thing about writing novels. You're like, wow, that's true. I never noticed that. Apparently, I'm obsessed with old women. I tend to write about them a lot. So my first novel is, there's a grandmother and a granddaughter who have a kind of similar relationship, and there's history in it. So if you liked Orphan Train, you might like that one. My second novel, Desire Lines, is based on and inspired by a girl who was at high school when I was in Maine, very close to my high school, who was strangled and killed, and they never found her murderer, and he was found this week. It's a national news story. I know, amazing. They finally charged him this week. Her name is Joyce McLean. It's national news. You may have seen it. I was 2 years behind her in high school. It was such a huge deal in my world at the time, and you know, justice for Joyce. And so I wrote this novel inspired by that, and that's Desire Lines. And then The Way Life Should Be, which by the way is the Maine state slogan. That is the Maine state slogan. Is about a woman who grows up in an Italian family. She's Italian. She learns to cook from her Italian grandmother, again, old lady, and the book is filled with recipes. I used to cook professionally, so it was really fun to write that book, and I just got an email from someone today who's making every recipe in the book. So, and then Bird in Hand is probably my darkest and I would say most literary book. In some ways it's my favorite. It's about a car accident that sets in motion the change that happens in 4 people's lives. And so it's not the most lighthearted of all my books, but you might like it if you like those darker books. Okay, and Christina's World, I'll just tell you quickly. I grew up in Bangor, Maine, as you know, in part, about an hour from where this painting was actually made. Cushing, Maine, the coast of Maine, this house that is in the painting. Do any of you know it? It's a woman I'm going to add it to my slideshow. It's a woman in a pink dress sitting in a field looking at this gray house in the distance. It's a very odd painting. Some people say it's an iconic American painting along with Whistler's Mother and Grant Wood's American Gothic. But my parents knew Jamie Wyeth a little bit, the son of Andrew Wyeth, and I had grown up back in the day when I was 8. Wow. Maybe that's it. Just to quickly finish, when I was young, my father thought I looked like this girl. We didn't really know she was crippled then from the back, and so I've always been obsessed with it. And I wrote her story and the story of her relationship with the painter. And it is actually, there's a lot of real, true. It killed me to do it, but writing about a real person is really hard. But it's done, and it's coming out next year. Thank you all so much.